Hello, I'm John Towse, and together with Rob Davis, Rebecca James, and Ellie Ball, I'm going to talk to you in this session about an online tool for training students in thinking about data management and data sharing. It's a system we call LUSTRE, which we'll be explaining shortly, and we'd like to take you through this presentation in a number of steps or stages. So our outline for this session is as follows. To start with, we're going to ask, what's the data problem? We're going to establish the problem that we want to focus on in this presentation. Secondly, we're going to talk about some broad guiding principles to addressing this data problem. And these guiding principles are highly convergent and consistent with materials that has been presented in other sessions as part of this symposium. In particular, the emphasis on starting training early and the normalization of desirable behaviour amongst students and early researchers for the sorts of skills we want to develop. That will provide the springboard for us to talk about how we embed data management in the teaching curriculum in the psychology department at Lancaster University. We'll describe what LUSTRE is, and we'll also show you briefly how LUSTRE works, as well as enabling you to look at it and find more information about it. This will also then allow us to think about how we can evaluate attitudes about open data and open research amongst our students and the potential impact that learning about data management has on those attitudes. And then we'll wrap up by thinking about ways in which the system might be developed and conclusions that we think are appropriate from the material that we're presented. So that's the running order for this session. Let me begin then by asking, what's the data problem that we want to focus on in this session? When people talk about the data problem in research and scholarship, most of the current debate, most of the current communication focuses on the data sharing problem as being the relatively low prevalence of data sharing. So the problem is, within science, not enough scientific outputs provide the underlying data to allow us to verify, to develop, to innovate with the empirical evidence on which those outputs have been based. Now, we certainly agree that that is a problem. And indeed, there's plenty of evidence that that is a problem. Here's a recent paper by Tom Hardwick and colleagues that focused on a number of open research practices in the social sciences by looking at a number of papers published between 2014 and 2017. And in the section that I've highlighted here, you can see that very few papers of those that they inspected provided the raw data. In fact, only 11 papers out of 156, so less than 10% of the papers, involved publicly shared data. That is, indeed, to us, seen as a problem. In psychology in particular, a recent paper that I worked on with colleagues that's going to appear in Behaviour Research Methods looked at a range of journals, 15 journals, and we looked through a number of those papers. In fact, we searched over 2,000 of those papers to see which of them might have publicly shared data. And of the over 2,000 papers we searched, there were over 1,900, which, if you like, were eligible for shared data. So we can exclude commentaries, editorials, a variety of research pieces that don't involve empirical data. And of those, 71 papers contained open data. That's less than 4% of the sampled space. And this figure shows you that the prevalence of open data can vary quite considerably across different journals. In some journals, there's a much higher rate of data sharing than in others. But overall, the proportion or frequency of data sharing is very low. Now, undoubtedly, we agree with many others that this is a problem, this is an issue. However, it's actually not the data problem that we're going to focus on in this talk. It's not necessarily the crux of the problem, because it isn't just about the presence of research data. It isn't just about whether people, researchers that is, have shared the underlying data to their output, but it's the form of the research data that we want to focus on here, and we want to think about in terms of the data problem. That is, even when researchers do share data, what do they share? On the left of this graph, in blue, is shown some data from Dominique Roche and colleagues who looked at a sample of papers in ecology and evolution, and they examined those data sets from the papers. They examined those data sets in terms of the quality of the shared data, in terms of the completeness of the data, which is shown in the top graph, and in terms of the reusability of the data in the bottom graph. And the red dashed line is a mark of whether they found those papers to be pretty much complete and pretty much reusable, or whether there were problems. And you can see that a large number of the data sets they looked at were not complete and had substantial issues with reusability. When we looked at the same metrics with psychological data sets using those 71 cases of open data we found, you see, in fact, there's a remarkable similarity in the distribution and the quality of data sets that we looked at. Another way of phrasing this is to say that when you look at the form of research data, the majority of open data sets that we looked at in psychology were incomplete. There were missing data. Sometimes there was too much data without information about which data had been removed or excluded from an analysed data set. There wasn't an explanation of the data. There wasn't a dictionary. A variety of ways in which the data couldn't be interpreted with reference to the work that was published. Moreover, the large majority of these open data sets had reusability issues. They were saved in files that were potentially difficult to access. They were in proprietary formats. Again, if they didn't have explanations, a data dictionary, a way of understanding what the different data columns were, then they were deemed to be difficult to reuse because they weren't going to be able to interpret. Moreover, in the psychological data set, we also found, and this was a question that Roche et al. Hadn't looked at because they were sampling data sets in a different way, but within psychology, almost half of the data sets that we looked at, published between 2014 and 2017, were at risk of being orphaned from the research papers from which they're based. That is, they were being held in a repository or in a place in such a way that there was a substantial risk that they could disappear because file structures would change, repositories or supplementary files would disappear, and we found some examples of where this had actually happened. Non-persistent identifiers were used to link to them. And so there were a whole variety of problems for a large segment of the data sets that we did find. So one way of summarizing this is to say that really we think that one has to acknowledge and address the quality of data problem and not just the prevalence or the low prevalence of data sharing to start with. So we think that we should try, as a discipline, as a science, as a research base, one should try and address this data problem. So how should we go about doing it? Even when you accept this is a serious issue, what should we do? Well, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that this isn't just about academic work. Previous slides have focused on empirical data about research data underlying outputs, underlying journal articles. But the underlying data problem, data sharing and the quality of data, is just as relevant outside the academic setting. There are many opportunities in data science where corporations, businesses, communities share data and allow others to innovate with it, reuse it, and find applications for it. There are also numerous cases, again, outside the academic literature, where problems with data management, the lack of data sharing, the lack of data security leads to substantial problems and issues. So we need to think about this not just in the academic sector, but more broadly as something that many people experience in a whole variety of professions in which they work. And it's important to start addressing this and finding ways to improve the situation. And for those who have followed the TIA Symposium so far, you'll see a number of resonances, a number of similarities in themes or guiding principles about how to develop change. Start early. In other words, try and develop the habits, the skills, the principles and practices that we think that our students should have. Do it early before bad habits have developed. Rather than having to correct problematic habits, start the good habits early and engage students with the process that you're interested in. Don't ignore it, but get students thinking about these issues in a way that allows them to appreciate their importance, not just from a distant perspective of reading what others do, but engage in terms of the practices that they have and the ways in which, in this case, they can use data and use other people's data as well as their own. We want to normalize the desirable, the reproducible behaviour that eventually we want to see in researchers and in professionals who handle data in many different ways. And we're also going to try and improve this situation by explaining the importance, justifying and promoting these good practices that we can put in place in a curriculum. One way to think about behavioural change coming from large-scale attempts through units like the nudge units in the UK and around the world is you can think about the circumstances that promote change and scaffold it as a set of principles called EAST, where EAST stands for making the change easy, attractive, social and timely. And we think this is actually a good framework for thinking about the data problem. problem. We want to make data sharing and good quality data sharing easy. We want to make it attractive by showing how it can help the student and how what others do also helps them. By engaging a cohort in the process, we're making it social. It's not just one individual who's doing it, and timely. We're trying to show that this can be brought into a workflow before students get too far down the road. You don't want to try and address the data problem the day that an action letter comes from a journal editor accepting a paper. You don't want to address the data problem on the day that students submit an empirical project. Their focus will be elsewhere. Instead, we want to introduce this early into the system so that students can plan and develop and utilize the system in an efficient and effective way. So let's turn to the details of how we do this using LUSTRE. So LUSTRE stands for the Lancaster University STatistics REsource. And when we talk about LUSTRE, we're really talking about a website in which a number of project records are displayed and can be searched and utilized by students and for students. That website is shown on this slide here, and we're also going to take you through some of the systems that we use to curate and develop the LUSTRE system. So LUSTRE is built on an open source framework. It's from an approach using Omeka, which is used for digital assets in the humanities and the social sciences. So it's an example of an Omeka build for displaying these, but that's open source, and our development of it has also been open source and is available on GitHub. Omeka, and therefore LUSTRE, uses a set of metadata elements from Dublin Core, which is a way of capturing a range of metadata elements that can help to capture the key things, in this case, about empirical projects. And at Lancaster, we teach our MSc students about LUSTRE as part of a module on conducting and presenting research. Now that module teaches a whole range of skills, from basic programming through to how to use online surveys, to how to present research data, and so on. We have a session on data management, and as part of that data management session, we look at the issues of data sharing and student responsibilities. We've also built a website to help explain the system and explain how students can use the system and help students to complete the activities that we set for them. We've also developed a set of resources, a set of forms that we use to capture project information and facilitate them being uploaded onto the database so that they can be used. LUSTRE is a byword for us for promoting data management. As I've already said, at its front end, it's an online student project database. But in many ways, what's important is not the database at the front end, but what underlies it, what lies beneath the surface, and the activities that surround it, that we feel are the most important aspects of the system. For example, the project records all contain key elements or metadata components and all of these can be searched and examined. And these can be used to make decisions on the value of the underlying data and the project record itself. For example, one of the metadata elements is the name of the supervisor of the project that was carried out. Why is that relevant? Well, it means that a student who's thinking about doing a research project can search and filter the projects by a supervisor. So if they're interested in carrying out a project under a particular individual, they can use the LUSTRE system to find out what sort of projects that person has supervised in the past. Now, aside from its use of data management, that can be a useful way of engaging students in the process of finding out what other people have done previously. Likewise, they can filter projects by the sorts of analysis that the student attempted in that project. What sort of inferential tests we used, or what sort of approaches we used. Again, those form metadata elements that can be used for filtering and search, so that students can look at the past repository of projects and think about how their own ideas and their own ambitions are going to fit into that. LUSTRE also provides a training platform for students to think about data management and think about open data. So students can access these past projects, and they learn that they're expected to contribute their own empirical work eventually to that database. So data management isn't just an abstract thing that other people engage in, or as we've seen, don't engage in. This isn't something that is just an obstacle for students to be able to get their hands on data and reanalyze things. This is now a part of a community asset that they can use and they will also contribute to. As part of the LUSTRE system, we also ask all of the records to contain a consent form. We want a consent form because we want to know what participants agreed to when they contributed their data, when they were involved in the study, and therefore what the rights and responsibilities over the data might be. But this also means that there's a collection or a catalogue of consent forms that have been used in different research projects across psychology, whether it's working with infants or working with other psychology students, or working with participants in the community or wherever. This means students can draw on examples of consent forms that others have used that have actively worked, rather than needing to develop them from scratch or develop them from very abstract research methods textbooks, which might or might not be appropriate for what they're doing. It also allows us to start encouraging students to think about data management from the consent form. We want students to be thinking about how their data management plans might speak to what they ask in consent forms of their participants, in particular, how data might be used and shared and curated. We also adopt a lagged contribution system to provide experience and training in the system. What I mean by that is each year we give students, as we teach them about LUSTRE and teach them about data management, we give them a bunch of data records from the preceding cohort. And we ask them to look at those records, to inspect them, to think about them, and then to upload the relevant data to the system. So they get to see what previous students, last year's students, did around data management. They get to see their project records and the data sets, and they're asked to upload the relevant information, including those consent forms that I was talking about, to add to the system. That gives them direct exposure and experience in how the system can be used, which we think can help students understand the process that they're going to engage in when they do their project.
Hi, my name is Ellie and welcome to the supporting website to LUSTRE. This website was created to provide more information about the LUSTRE system, including how students can use LUSTRE to help create and plan their own projects. This Planning Your Master's Project with LUSTRE webpage demonstrates how the LUSTRE system can provide information that will aid and make it easier for students to plan their projects. As you can see from this menu, this webpage discusses how students can filter the student record database by supervisor, year of study, methodology and statistical analysis, sample sizes, and examples of consent forms. On this webpage, students can simply select an option from the menu for more information about the LUSTRE system and how it can make it easier for them to plan their projects. So, for example, if I was to click on Exploring Sample Sizes, it will take me to the Exploring Sample Sizes section of the page, giving me a more in-depth explanation about how the LUSTRE system provides information about previous projects and their sample sizes. Now I'm going to take you to the Contributing to the LUSTRE section of the website. Under this section, students can learn how to add a record to the database. This section also provides explanations and solutions webpage. But first, let me take you to the user's guide for adding a record to the database. This section of the website provides students with screenshots of the LUSTRE upload page and the data acquisition form, using visual aids and step-by-step instructions to demonstrate clearly how to upload a record onto the LUSTRE system. The screenshots and step-by-step guide allow the students to go at their own pace and allows them to refer back to the guide if they become lost or confused. You will notice at the bottom of the page, students can click a link to another web page on the website that will explain the data acquisition form in more detail. So I'm going to click this link and this will bring me nicely onto our final web page. Explanations and solutions discussing the data acquisition form. This web page offers two things. It explains the data acquisition form in more detail, giving examples on what information students would provide for each section of the form. This helps students to become more familiar with the data acquisition form and helps to avoid confusion when they fill out their own form. Towards the bottom of the page, it also offers a frequently asked questions section. This section makes it easier to provide answers and solutions to commonly asked questions or problems students have occurred previously when uploading their data record, making the upload process a lot simpler for students if they come across a similar problem. And that is the supporting website to the
My name is Rebecca James and I will be discussing the data acquisition and upload components of the LUSTRE system. So what we've got here in front of us on the screen is the most recent data acquisition form for the LUSTRE system. This form is given to master's students upon completion of their dissertation and they work through this form, fill it out. That is then sent to the uploaders who put it onto the LUSTRE system. So I'm just going to give you a quick walkthrough of this form and show you the LUSTRE upload process. So this form is relatively straightforward. It has been adapted according to student feedback and will continue to be adapted based upon student feedback and as more uploads happen on the system. So as you can see, it's quite straightforward. Basic details such as project title, creator name and project submission date are asked before it goes into more detail. The collection section of this form is a more recent addition. This didn't used to be asked of students. It was down to the uploader to decide what research collection the project was reflective of. Now students can pick from a drop-down menu which research method is most reflective of their project. So for example, if you completed a research study using EEG techniques, you'd simply select that. It's worth mentioning that you can only currently select one collection, as this is all that the Dublin Core format will allow, but this might also change dependent on feedback and whether we see the need to have multiple collections. It's then another straightforward process of copy and pasting abstract keywords and method from their dissertation. They're then asked about the format of the data and the rights that the data have. This goes into more detail about the different types of data formatting and different rights on the LUSTRE website. Students are asked whether there is any relation between their piece of work and previous work, or whether they have worked in a group project, and this allows for connections between their research and other research on the LUSTRE system and beyond. They're also asked if there are multiple languages used in the project, or if there are any cultural comparisons, because that is important to note. There are also more simple questions, such as the type of the resource, supervised name, and project level. A more recent addition is also the topic section of this form. This used to be open to interpretation. Students would decide themselves what the subcategory that their research fell under was. But this meant that this section got overlooked quite a bit and people didn't actually complete it. So that led to incomplete data on the LUSTRE system, whereas now it's been narrowed down and there are certain subcategories for the student to pick from. Obviously, if the subcategory is not reflective of the data, there is an other box for them to fill in. And it's a similar sort of process with the most recent edition of the statistical analysis type section. Just slimlines the process, makes it as simple and easy as possible, because we want to make it easier, because we want the students to become involved in the process and be more likely to complete the form, because the more simple that it is, the more likely they are to complete it. And finally, we ask students for data files, including a blank consent form, data files, a code book if necessary, and a data analysis code. Out of these, the only thing that is uploaded to the LUSTRE system is blank consent form for privacy and confidentiality reasons. There's also a link provided to the LUSTRE website if the students want any more information on LUSTRE or any guidance. Now, this data acquisition form has changed quite a bit to be reflective of the Dublin core format of the LUSTRE upload system. So this is what the uploader sees once they have taken this data from the data acquisition form and put it onto the upload system. As you can see, it's very reflective of the data acquisition form, and the similarities are very obvious. It makes for a very easy upload process, and it's just a case of the uploader essentially copying and pasting and not having to do a lot of the work themselves, because the student has already done that for them in the form. So the new data acquisition form makes it relatively simple for both student and uploader to complete this data acquisition process and data upload process. Although it should be noted that the data acquisition form is incredibly efficient, but it can definitely be more efficient, and this will change upon student feedback. And the more uploads that occur on the system, the data acquisition form will change at the same speed to make it the most efficient that it can be.
Hello, my name is Rob Davies. So we think that working with the LUSTRE project will enable students to learn about data management, give them the experience they need to figure out how to use for themselves a system that allows them to manage the research data and make it accessible for others. What do our current students think? We have data we collected through a questionnaire, and also data that we can share relating to their experience of working with other sources of information. We can't really talk about data with respect to the students' experience of working with the LUSTRE system, but we can talk about the ways in which we will need to develop the student learning experience through the course of their program to enable them to effectively share data and manage data. So in our research methods teaching in postgraduate programs, we ask students to work with secondary data analyses for their assessments. We ask them to access data online and conduct secondary analyses of those data, which they could be data from shared repositories through the Open Science Framework or journal article supplementary materials. What we find is that students are typically struggling to access and work with the data that is shared online. So these include data that they find on Open Science Framework, as well as data they find through journal articles, or data that are shared through some of the journals that are now working to present data sets for other scientists. So we often get testimony like the one that I've quoted in the slide, where a student says that basically, they spend hours looking through the data, they don't know what to make of the variables, and they don't know how to work with them for the purpose of doing secondary data analyses. So this is one half of the kind of experience that we're working with in the process of teaching students to, or enabling students to work in a kind of an open research approach. We conducted then a questionnaire study where we asked students what they thought about open data and really kind of what they were looking for in terms of finding and sharing data. So 20 students out of a cohort of 45 or so completed the questionnaire, and most of them agreed that it is a good thing to share data, that data should be publicly available, it should be easy to use, and agreed that student data should be accessible, should be available for others to use. Students were split on whether data, making data publicly available now is simple or straightforward. And I think this reflects their experience in the course of completing assessments, the secondary data assessments in the research methods classes. They all think that open data is a good thing, that increases the benefits of data collection. So there's a kind of a moral, ethical dimension, that democratizes knowledge. So there's quite a high sense of idealism around what we should do with research data that the students express. And that sharing data increases the credibility of research findings through enabling reproducibility replication checks. Obviously, students also say that sharing data enables secondary data analysis and it enables learning. So there's a strong sense in the questionnaire data that we've collected, as well as through the testimony we acquire from interacting with students through the research methods classes, that students recognize the need for open data, for sharing data. And they also recognize the need to make those data easily usable. What we now need to find out is whether we can train students in order to themselves make the data readily available and easy to use, and whether that's possible using the LUSTRE system.
So in this final slide, I'm going to try and reflect and summarize the materials that we've gone through in this presentation. We see LUSTRE as an evolving and scalable resource, so we can add to the website content and the website materials. We can obviously add more records to the LUSTRE database as more students go through their projects. And we can add more information to the OSF page devoted to LUSTRE with other resources and links, more materials that are used for teaching and so on. It's also scalable in a number of different ways. So not only can we add more records, potentially records could also be added from other institutions. One of the meta tags is the source of the data, or who publishes the data. So just as we have Lancaster University. There could be other institutions that have their records added. It's also possible for other institutions to install their own version of the LUSTRE system for their own purposes. So it can easily be developed. It can easily grow. One of the important things we'd like to point out is that this data management system, the LUSTRE system, can be can have uptake either in full or in part. So we've talked about how we use the system, but at its basis, most basic, all one might need to do is present a session on data management to students to expose them to some of these issues around data sharing in research and outside research. Alternatively, one could have additional systems to expose students to what student data looks like and what it might look like. Or you can have a more full-blooded system of data sharing and data training, or there are undoubtedly other resources, exercises and activities that you could use to take this system that we have further, indeed much further than we have. Any or all of these will be useful, will have their place, depending on how it will fit into curriculum and what other constraints or resources you're operating under. But to summarize, what we're seeking to do here is to address the data problem. That is the quality of research data, the quality of data more generally. Not only encouraging people to think about appropriate sharing of data, but think about the quality of that shared data to maximize its usefulness, to maximize the ability for it to be taken up by others, to allow them to innovate and develop with it. And in order to do that, we're starting early. So we're asking our master's students to contribute their research data. We're getting them involved in the practice of data sharing, not just as something others do, but something they do. We're making this behaviour of data sharing just a more normal part of a research workflow, so that the habits that people develop and eventually, hopefully, the attitudes that they will develop is that data sharing is a process that everybody goes through. You'll also hopefully have seen an emphasis in that we're not just commanding people to do the data sharing. We're not pointing a finger and saying, this is what you do, but we're trying to engage and train. We're trying to look at how others have done it, how they can do it, how they can help others in doing it and doing it better, and so on. We're also trying to expose some of the obstacles and bottlenecks to data sharing. As students look at what others have done and the limits that they've had to place on data sharing, or the limits in the usefulness of their data because of what they haven't provided, what they've failed to document, or what they've missed, they can learn the lessons. They can build on these examples to put together a more productive piece of work for themselves and for others. And so ultimately we've embedded all of this into the student experience so that they become more skilled and more reflective and aware of data management and its relevance for contemporary ideas.